I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we'll discuss the intense fighting in the Donbas as Russian forces close in on Severodonetsk, and we look at the impact of the conflict on potash, sanctions, and rainforests.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. To do all of this, I'm joined by Nicholls, the Telegraph's defence and security editor, and business reporter Ben Gartside. So, Dom, can we start with you? What's the latest from the Eastern Front?
Hi, David. Hi, everyone. Severodonetsk, the city in the east of the Donbas, the pocket that Russia's trying to close. Anywhere between 50 and 70% of that city is now in Russian hands. The figures vary according to the source. It's obviously very confusing news coming out of there, but a significant portion, if not most, is in Russian hands. Now, the Russian fighters, we should say, they are a mixture of Chechen fighters, the Wagner Group, mercenaries, and VDV, the airborne forces. So how they're working together, we don't know. How good they are at coordinating their attacks, or if it's just as has been reported elsewhere, a sort of headlong rush to gain ground with huge casualties. We're not sure. If they take Severodonetsk, are they going to be able to continue to push west? Unlikely, especially as these forces are light forces. They are not especially, or they're not used to working with armour, and we don't know how well they work together. So Severodonetsk under extreme pressure. What happens next? If and as is likely, the city falls, we don't know. Worth talking, as we've talked many times before on this pod, about what could happen after some sort of pause. Elsewhere, the Ukraine knitting together some small counterattacks, I should say, down in the south of the country around Kherson, and actually there's reports of Ukrainian partisan activity around Zaporizhia, which is just slightly to the sort of northeast of Kherson, such that Russian troops are having to move around in heavily armed columns on main roads to protect against ambushes, and the troops there are thought to be not very strong and not great quality, so particularly susceptible to that kind of activity. HIMARS we will talk about in a moment. The latest gift of munitions to Ukraine from the US. Interesting comments from Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, overnight on that. And just finally, the Russian build-up on Snake Island continues. Remember Snake Island in the northwest of the Black Sea, a very small dot of rock, but pivotal if you want to try and, for either side, if you want to dominate that area and try and launch anything into the southwest of Ukraine. The floating crane that we've seen there for some days is still there, trying to lift the Cerner-class landing craft that was sunk and is blocking the entrance way to get other heavy stuff from ships, other landing craft on Snake Island. But Russia's still very keen to build up its forces on Snake Island. I'll take a pause there.
Thanks, Dom. Before we come back to talking about the rocket systems, can I bring in Ben Gartside? We learnt today, Ben, that Russia's on course to suffer its deepest recession since the collapse of the Soviet Union, falling 15% today. Can you talk about that? What's happening in Russia?
Sure. Hi, everyone. So according to a report today from our Brussels correspondent, Joe Barnes, Russia is expected to have a recession of around 15%, which on the face of it might not sound kind of too bad. It is kind of a historically huge recession, one of the biggest in Russia, kind of since, as you say, the fall of the Soviet Union. And kind of to put it in a UK context, this kind of have to go back to kind of the 18th century, really, to see kind of a sustained recession that large with kind of the Great Frost. And kind of what's kind of important regarding this Russian recession is that the financial picture in Russia in previous years has not been strong. In 2014 to 16, they had a financial crisis. They've kind of, in recent years, not kind of had huge levels of growth. And this kind of sustained recession of 15%, and it's not expected to be a bounce back recession. You may have heard kind of post-COVID the phrase that a V-shaped recession where down very quickly and up very quickly again. We kind of aren't expecting this with this kind of Russian financial crisis. So this will be a sustained kind of impact on Russian finances with 15% down this year, and then analysts believe somewhere between 0% and 3% down next year, which means that you are still going to, as an everyday Russian citizen, see your kind of pay, your cost of living, your kind of quality of life be really significantly impacted to the extent that kind of all the gains and kind of financial benefits that have been seen in Russia in the past decade essentially have been wiped off, which is huge in kind of for kind of everyday consumers.
Thanks, Ben. Let's move back then to these rocket systems, Dom, that you mentioned earlier. I think you've learnt more about this since we mentioned it yesterday. What's the latest there?
So just to go back a little stage, on Monday, President Joe Biden was asked about supplying weapons to Ukraine. So Ukraine, for a long time now, weeks, have been asking for long-range artillery. Anything that they're very clear that anything is helpful. Even the helmets Germany is supplying, everything's helpful, but they're really after long-range artillery to push the Russian artillery back and hopefully destroy that artillery that is causing such destruction to civilian areas and also to the Ukraine's forces. So they're after long-range artillery, and they were specifically asking. They've taken delivery of the M777, so towed howitzers. They're specifically asking for multiple launch rocket systems, and the HIMARS systems, the high mobility artillery rocket system, anyway, a multiple launch rocket system, which could go. Missiles could go 60, 70 Ks. Now, Joe Biden on Monday said that they weren't going to supply any weapons that would be able to strike inside Russia. And on the face of it, and I was very critical of this yesterday, I said, well, that doesn't make any sense at all. I mean, any weapon, if you've got a border with Russia, then any weapon can strike inside Russia. And there was a sort of rushed defence of this position, suggesting that actually, no, what he meant was really long range stuff, so stuff that could threaten a long way inside Russia. It opened up a whole debate about, well, what's wrong with that? They've attacked Ukraine. Isn't it all fair game? But it was deemed too escalatory and too provocative to Russia if the US was supplying weapons that could fire hundreds of kilometres inside Russia. And the weapons system we were talking about was the ATACMS, the Army Tactical Missile System, which is fired from the HIMARS vehicle. It is fired from it's a multiple launch rocket system. It's just a different round. It's one massive great missile basically, and that can go about 300 kilometers. So it was all interpreted, but Joe Biden didn't use the phrases HIMARS or ATACMS and get into kind of those weeds. But it was interpreted that this was not ATACMS was not going to be sent to Ukraine. Regardless, Dmitry Medvedev, the former Russian president and prime minister, he sort of ping-ponged in and out of post according to Putin's whim. So according to Russia's constitution, Putin had to step down as president for a bit, and so Medvedev stepped up and Putin was prime minister, but we all know who was pulling the strings. Anyway, Dmitry Medvedev, he's the chairman of the National Security Council in Russia, so still a big player, a long-time ally of Putin. He said that this comment from Biden was, quote, rational. And again, as I said, I was critical yesterday of Joe Biden saying, well, if Dmitry Medvedev is coming out on your side, then you've probably made a mess. Now, so last night, America said that they would supply HIMARS, and the mood music was, or they've talked about the natures of ammunition that they will be able to supply, and it did not include ATACMS. So the standard HIMARS, which can still reach 60 or 70 Ks. It's that long-range artillery that Ukraine have been asking for a long time, which would have been very, very helpful in the current fight when Russia had concentrated their force in the Donbas. So these kind of things would have been very helpful in that. But hey, no point looking backwards. Got to go forward. So HIMARS finally on the way, and I just wonder. I've suggested in today's Telegraph newsletter, which I think you need to register the Telegraph, and you get the newsletter 3 times a week. You might get a load of adverts for flannel cords and pastel shirts and God knows what else. But anyway, you can register for the it's free. You can register for the newsletter. I've suggested today that this is either a gaffe by Biden, or, given what's happened today and the response from Medvedev, the best piece of diplomacy we've seen so far in the war. I'd be really grateful to any of our any of our US colleagues who have an opinion are much better sort of dialed into what's happening in the White House if they give us an idea. But I just wonder if by inviting this comment from Medvedev, he said it was rational to talk about these, not striking inside Russia. It's reframed the debate about these weapons in terms of geography rather than capability. And what I mean is that once you start talking about geography and saying, okay, weapons that are of use and primarily to be used in Ukraine, okay, it might stray over the border, but we're not attacking Russia. President Zelensky this morning said, look, we're not interested in Russia. We're interested in our territory. We don't want to fight them there. We'll fight them here. So again, framing it in terms of geography. This kind of moves the debate on a bit from what it was a few weeks ago. You remember MiG-gate, when the alleged MiG-29s from Poland that Poland wanted to supply to Ukraine. That plan was sort of put on hold by the US, fearing it was going to be escalatory, too provocative to Russia. But if the debate now is about geography, it sort of moves away from capability. And I think that's got to be a good thing. It's had the stamp of approval from Russia. If Medvedev says it's rational to talk in these terms, again, geography, then I think there is room here to say, right, well, that now gives the markers. That we all know what the playing field is now. And that hopefully will give confidence to other nations who might want to be supplying weapons, but will fear any reprisals. If this doesn't go well and Russia prevail, then some countries, smaller countries, closer to the fight, might feel a bit left out in the cold if they've been supplying weapons. Russia might, they might exert some sort of revenge on them. So the fact that the debate now seems to be weapons are linked to geography and firing inside Ukraine is okay. It's the capability. The capability is no longer the central issue. I think that's got to be a good thing. That we have had. So today, on the back of the announcement the US is going to supply HIMARS, Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, said that this would be, quote, adding fuel to the fire. So, thanks, Dmitry. Plenty of fires already to be dealing with. No need for that. And he said that this kind of action is not going to encourage Ukraine to resume peace talks. So again, well, fine. You say what you like, but I'll tell you what's not going to encourage Ukraine to resume peace talks, and that's having their cities smashed up and civilians killed and the atrocities we've all seen. So I think I'm very willing to eat humble pie on this. If I've got this wrong, very, very happy to say that. If this is a masterstroke of diplomacy from the Biden administration and that they were seeking to reframe the debate, then I think that's genius. I'm not convinced that happened, actually. I think this is a lucky happenstance after some fairly murky, opaque language from the president earlier on this week. Very helpful that Medvedev came out with the phrase it is, and of course now, Russia are backtracking and saying, well, it's unhelpful and fuel to the fire and so on and so forth. But I put it out there partly as news and partly as comment and partly as a bit of self-flagellation. If I've got this completely wrong, and I was very critical yesterday of the president's words, if it's a masterstroke of diplomacy, then bring on the humble pie.
Thanks, Tom. Can we just stay with you for a moment? We've got a live question from Charles who's asking, why is it taking so much time for Western weapons to arrive? He says, are the Germans just not delivering, or is there a military reason?
Yes, there's a military reason. There's politics as well, of course. And thanks for the question, Charles. Very, very briefly, because it is a little bit dull, but just having the stuff, having the heavy metal that you can touch is not a capability. So in the British military, we have this lexicon called tepid oil, right? So to bring a capability into service, you need the training. You need the equipment itself, you need the personnel, you need the information about how it works, you need the doctrine about how you're going to fight it, you need the organisations, physically the structures, the brigades and the battalions, you need the infrastructure to look after it, and logistics. So tepid oil. And only once you've ticked off all of those bits and pieces is your piece of kit good to go. Anybody can just get a bit of kit and then sort of chuck it into the fight. But if you haven't got all those things lined up, you've only got kit, you haven't got capability. And I know that sounds a bit wonkish, but that is what military capability is. And if you just take this stuff off the railhead in Western Ukraine, shove it straight up the front, and you don't know how to use it, you don't know how to look after it, you don't know how to store it properly, you don't have the right doctrine so that it works with all the other pieces of your military, you haven't trained your people on it well enough, then it's not going to last very long. It might not be destroyed, but you're just not going to be able to use it. So in order to bring kit into service, you need all those things ticked off. The tepid oil, all ticked off. Now, in wartime, you can take some risks. Okay, you don't have to train up to the nth degree. You don't have to build all the air-conditioned hangars to look after your stuff properly. Your doctrine can be, shove it up there and let's have a go and see what happens. So you can take some risk and cut a few corners. But essentially, you do need to have considered every single one of those 8 areas before you can actually start using this stuff. So there's a whole load of things going on in the background, bar things being flown into Poland or taken on the railhead down to the border of Ukraine and handed over. There's a lot more at play here. Now, I'm not trying to excuse those countries that have talked big and offered little. Okay, and we've discussed that many times as well. But just on the actual physical, once something arrives near to the border of Ukraine, why is it not brought into service the next day? There's a multitude of reasons for that, and hopefully I'll just flesh some of those out. If that hasn't answered your question, please DM me and I'll go into even more boring detail about tepid oil.
Thank you very much, Dom. Let's turn to Ben Gartside, our business reporter. Ben, we had lots of interesting chats earlier today when we were preparing for this, and you wanted to come on and talk about potash and the impact of the war 1,000 miles away and on supply chains and on fertilizers. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what you've been reading?
Sure. So obviously today there's more sanctions news, which I'm sure we're going to go into in a second, but I think it's quite helpful to kind of look at kind of the previous impact of sanctions and the impact of kind of the conflict so far on the global economy, because I feel that we always kind of talk positively about, oh great, more sanctions coming, and in many ways it is kind of good that countries and their economies are kind of making that sacrifice and saying, okay, great, we're going to put in some sanctions, we're going to do something, we're going to kind of try and kibosh the kind of Russian and Belarusian economy by implementing them. But a lot of the time we don't actually kind of look back and look at how are these kind of sanctions going. And a great example of this is the potash market, which is, for kind of those that don't know, it's kind of like, to dumb it down quite a lot, it's a type of fertilizer that's very common in usage. And the kind of market of production of this is dominated within Russia and Belarus. 42% of the global economy of potash comes from Belarus. And therefore kind of the outbreak of the war and kind of the ostracization of the kind of Belarusian economy and kind of the outright kind of opposition to the Russian economy has therefore had a huge impact on this market. Today, if you look at prices, before in 2020, prices were around $200 a ton. Today, they are around $1,100 a ton. Prices are up around 3 times in Northwest Europe, and then in Brazil it's close to 6 times. So there is a real squeeze on this potash price, and this is kind of going to be a long-running issue too. This isn't going to be kind of, as we've said earlier, a V-shaped recovery. This is going to be something that's kind of quite extensively impactful in the global economy, not something that if there was a peace deal tomorrow and kind of Russia retreated outside of Ukraine, gave back Crimea, gave back kind of the territory it's got, that it would still be a long-term effect on the global economy. Analysts expect that kind of they previously expected supply to increase around 15% to kind of interact with growing demand. So to simply stay still pre-war, they expected supply to go up 15%. However, a lot of that new supply was from Russia and Belarus. So now kind of there will be continuous inflation in this, which is not going to help kind of the food shortages and crop shortages we've discussed previously. So, and kind of this is with kind of Wall Street now expects that the minimum price going forward, the floor of prices will be $500 a ton, which means that prices are going to increase 2.5 times from what they were in 2020 and stay at that level going forward. There's no kind of return to the previous status quo in the potash market. This is kind of how we expect things to go continuously. And the interesting thing about that is that kind of when prices double very quickly, there is obviously a lot of money to be made. And you've now kind of seeing a lot of global firms kind of go in and really try and target the potash market. One area we've really seen this is Brazil. Brazil and Canada are two of the biggest suppliers outside of Russia and Belarus. And the kind of knock-on effect of kind of sanctions is now Brazil and President Bolsonaro really kind of looking at ways to kind of take advantage of this high price and kind of stop the issues in their own country where they've seen prices go up 6 times, but also kind of increase Brazil's trade, increase Brazil's global standing by kind of really targeting the potash market. Now, the opportunity cost of this is that this will kind of lead to a lot of environmental destruction, because potash in Brazil is traditionally found in rainforests. And there's kind of legislation within Brazil that says that in order to kind of extract potash, you need to win the support of the indigenous communities. And Bolsonaro has kind of already kind of suggested that indigenous communities should be more open to kind of potash mining and kind of getting potash. And that's obviously to kind of a negative impact in the environmental sector. And I think it kind of, in Brazil and kind of the rainforest, which has been so much campaigning about in previous years, and I think it's kind of a great case study in the kind of reality of sanctions, is that, yes, it's good that Russia's and Belarus's economy is being stymied, but you kind of have to make that opportunity cost. And it's not always kind of, as we're seeing today, kind of as many listeners in the UK will find out, like filling up the tank and it's a lot more expensive, but it's also kind of the environmental cost that you're going to have to kind of, there'll be to kind of keep fertilizer prices vaguely normal, and that's still with a significant increase. There needs to be kind of a lot of trade-off in terms of the rainforest and kind of a lot of environmental projects we take very seriously. And kind of as this conflict goes on, I think there's going to be a lot more thought and kind of a lot more of a reckoning put into that, because it is, there are so many trade-offs, and this is kind of one example, but this will be going on across numerous fields.
Well, thank you very much, Ben. That was fascinating and definitely slightly worrying for the future. You mentioned that you wanted to talk a little bit more about sanctions. Do you want to go back to that? What's new there? Sure.
So recently, the EU's 27 member states have agreed a ban of seaborne Russian oil imports. So very obviously, kind of if it comes via boat, it is now sanctioned. It kind of gives a bit of breathing space to pipelines, of which kind of Hungary, which were one of the main kind of opponents of sanctions for oil in the EU, kind of it's how it gets its oil. And that will come later in the year, apparently. By the end of 2022, they expect a ban on pipeline imports, which will mean that 90% of Russian oil exports will decline by the end of the year, according to EU kind of mathematics on this. This has kind of been hailed initially as kind of quite a good deal, but it's kind of worth digging into what the realities of this look like. And Russia, this is obviously going to hit Russia's exports, it's going to hit the amount of tax that the Russian government gets, and it's going to hit a lot of Putin's cronies who kind of run these Russian oil exporters. However, they have kind of made up a lot of that demand with kind of India and China, and kind of making up that money by kind of exporting to markets who, should we say, are less morally concerned about where this oil is coming and what it's funding. Capital Economics, which is kind of a consultancy, thinks that Russian oil exports will fall by a fifth this year, even allowing for the 15% rise kind of in economies such as China and India. And however, due to the price increase and due to the fact that there is this stifled demand that, say, if you are a oil importer in China, you may have previously got your oil from elsewhere, but now UK importers want that oil, so they're taking that. So you're having to go to the Russian market to make up for that. Despite the fact that they are being hit by kind of a 20% drop potentially in oil exports, the revenue that they are expecting to get is only down 1%, or is likely to only be down 1% lower than 2021, which kind of shows that, yes, the volume of oil exports is going down, but the receipts from oil exports are staying relatively still, which is kind of why it's worth taking these new sanctions with a pinch of salt. However, there is kind of an impact of kind of what does this mean for the kind of delay of the pipeline ban mean? And Hungary's kind of held up as the example. Viktor Orban has been very outspoken against kind of oil bans and has slowed down the entire process. Hungary's state-backed kind of oil company MOL, which is the only refinery in Hungary, it expects to make £2 billion from kind of this new setup. So there is a lot of economic benefit that can be taken from countries kind of turning a blind eye, especially when you consider that despite the fact that volume has dropped in 20% in Russian oil exports, the firms are expected to take essentially the same amount of money. So the European Commission kind of estimates that this impacting kind of cutting gas supply, which the EU does not look set to do. Estonia and kind of other kind of supportive nations of Ukraine have suggested, like, right, we need to cut down on gas imports from Russia. The EU is very unlikely to do that because cutting imports of Russian gas would impact EU GDP by about 2.5%, which obviously we've seen big numbers with Russia of 15%. We've seen big numbers coming out of the COVID kind of related recessions, and it's kind of sanitized a number 2.5% drop in GDP, which is really quite a significant drop. It's essentially taking household finances, at least in the UK, it would be like putting that back 3 years, which is a really significant impact. And that is one that kind of a lot of EU member states are obviously not willing to do. But kind of side note from the latest EU measures is the insurance market, which I know many people listening to the podcast will go, oh God, I don't want to talk about insurance. And fair enough, but this is actually quite important. So the insurance ban basically bans UK, EU firms from insuring tankers carrying Russian oil. Now, this means that that basically the insurance of ships is much harder and much riskier, which will mean that a lot of places, a lot of ships carrying it are just unwilling to do it. They're not willing to carry their own risk because if there's another oil tanker disaster, if there's kind of an issue there, the ships will be liable. And frankly, the ships are not willing to do that. If you kind of look at a lot of the ship nations who carry these kind of fleets, it's the UK, Greece, Cyprus, Malta. Within kind of Greece, Cyprus and Malta within the EU, there was a lot of concerns. They were pushing back against this, but it does kind of look to be done. And what this means is that it pushes kind of Russia's oil economy much more into kind of murkier territory. You're now kind of seeing themselves next to Venezuela and Iran, who kind of operate within sanctions as they do and find it a lot harder to get insurance as they do. It also means that the shipping routes become a lot harder. Denmark, for example. So if you're kind of going via the North Sea, going via Scandinavia as a Russian oil kind of exporter, Denmark is very, very opposed to non-insured vessels coming anywhere near Denmark due to kind of potential impacts of an oil disaster there. The exporter the boat's firm would immediately, ironically, sink financially. So therefore it means that shipping, just physically shipping the oil becomes a hell of a lot harder. And given that, as we've seen, there will always be demand for oil. There's no such thing as an oil startup. You can't kind of replace that demand via finding it somewhere else. There's a finite amount of oil on the planet, and there will always be more demand than supply, which means that Russia can kind of make up that money. The point where it becomes very hard is when it becomes very financially, regulatorily difficult to export that oil. And that's what potentially this insurance ban could do. So I think that's one really to keep an eye on in coming months.
Well, thank you, Ben. That was hugely in-depth. I think just what we needed to throw some nuance on some of the things that are being talked about in terms of sanctions. And as you said, the trade-offs that policymakers and the public are going to start thinking about. Dom, no worries if not. Did you have any thoughts or observations or questions for Ben listening to that? And of course, anybody else listening, if you do have questions, do please DM. We will try to get them out live.
I haven't, but I would like to say thanks to Ben for clearing up the stuff about the pipeline in Hungary and Orban. That's been a bee in my bonnet for a few days now. I've really not understood that, and I think that's very clear. Thank you very much. Great.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I mean, especially for the smaller European nations and the nature of kind of EU diplomacy, it's got to be all or nothing. You can't. There's no such thing as a majority vote within the EU, and it means that especially for kind of Hungary and then in terms of shipping, kind of Cyprus and Malta, these are economies where our exposure to kind of oil and issues there and issues with Russian exposure. The UK is a global economy. We're fifth biggest economy in the world. Fundamentally, will survive and make it up elsewhere. For smaller nations, especially those that border kind of Russia, it's really, really noting how important the sacrifice they're making is. And especially if you look at Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, not only is it a huge, courageous decision given the pure proximity of where they are compared to Russia, it's a huge, courageous decision given how much their economies are just intrinsically tied into Russia and kind of Russia supporting nations via geography. And kind of, yes, there's the bad side of this in Hungary in terms of they're going to make a lot of money via kind of this EU import kind of rule that's come in, and they're kind of mitigating a lot of the good efforts that have been done by other nations. But crucially, kind of a lot of those kind of especially quote unquote Visegrad nations who've been very outspoken, Poland, Estonia, Lithuania, Slovakia, as kind of we say, they've made real huge economic sacrifices, and far more than kind of the UK has made. And it's really worth kind of commending those decisions.
Just one question from me, Ben. That was a lot of information, and I thought very succinctly laid out. If you're listening, should people feel more positive from what you're saying about the impact of sanctions on Russia, or you highlighted that there are a lot of issues coming down the track in terms of cost of living and all the sort of interrelated supply chain stuff that you were talking about to do with potash. Should people be more positive about the impact of these sanctions on crippling the Russian economy, or more negative if there are nations starting to peel away and start to do their own thing and take advantage of the situation?
It's an interesting question, and I think kind of it kind of speaks to Dom's point earlier a bit in terms of when you see a country announce, oh, we're exporting weapons to Ukraine, we're kind of giving them these weapons to fight back. You initially, and kind of I do this all the time, I think, oh, brilliant, that's great, kind of that'll help the Ukrainian fight back. I look forward about reading the impact in tomorrow's paper, when realistically it takes a lot more time. There's a lot more kind of organizational, kind of procedural things that need to happen, and that's exactly the same with sanctions. If you kind of look at the Russian economy, especially within oil, it's less so about what the damage does now, and it's less so about the kind of immediate impact of financial sanctions, but it's more about kind of changing those supply chains more widely. Like, is Europe now going to actually just move away from Russian oil and gas post-conflict because of the fact that they've built up new supply chains, they've built up new kind of economic relationships elsewhere? And I think with sanctions, the thing is not necessarily about kind of doing things because they're going to cripple the economy of Russia and it's going to be down 40%. It's more about making life hard, adding another layer of thinking, making kind of everyday decisions in Russia for Russian businessmen, for Russian local politicians, for national politicians. Think, okay, right, because of this war, we are now having to jump through 5 extra hoops. We're now having to do this, that, the other. And while the Russian economy, at least from the national figures, looks fine, and they've not had any banks collapse, they've not had kind of bailouts of banks that we saw kind of during our 2008 recession, nothing like that's happening. I think it's easy to take it away and go, okay, it's fine. While there is kind of a huge impact on Russian consumers, and Russian consumers are very aware of this, and therefore kind of you would hope that the support for the war degrades. And it's kind of always hard to see the impact of sanctions kind of on that huge macro picture that says, oh, GDP is down X point Y%, when really kind of, and Potash is a great example of this, it's kind of in the finicky things of what does that actually mean? How are things changing? How are things adapting? And that's the best way to view sanctions. And I think within Russia, there's plenty of examples of sanctions working in some ways, and there's plenty of examples kind of with oil and gas of maybe there being a bit of room for skepticism. But I think long-term sanctions, these sanctions are not going to be just until a peace treaty is signed. This is going to be years afterwards, and kind of complete impacts of, say, I don't know, Gazprom, for example, now owned by the German government, but previously signed loads of contracts within UK government. They'd signed it with like the University of Huddersfield, or kind of Merton Council was one that had contracts with Gazprom to supply energy. if you are a procurement body in the UK or another nation, you are now going to take a huge amount of due diligence to any potential contract within Russia, even after this war ends, because you're thinking, what's the likelihood this happens again? What's the likelihood that things flare up in Transnistria, in Georgia, in kind of one of the Balkan nations? There is a huge amount of pause, I think, Baltic nations, sorry. There's a huge amount of pause in terms of that, and that is something that's going to stay with the Russian economy for the next 3-4 decades. That's not something that can kind of ever be really picked up on kind of a financial sheet or a projection sheet.
And before I ask you for your final thoughts, Ben and Dom, can we just talk about the Ukrainian reaction to this? Because, of course, Volodymyr Zelensky and Ukrainian diplomats and politicians are travelling to Europe and asking Europe and other nations for their support. What's their latest moves? I know Zelensky has been berating the EU for the slowness of their support, but what can we say today?
In terms of Zelensky's response to sanctions, he kind of criticised it for being too slow and too late. And I think that what was interesting was kind of, at least in some of the quotes that I've seen, was an absence of mentions of gas exports. I think it's kind of the realism that is potentially striking Ukrainians, that a lot of the support for sanctions and a lot of the support kind of is waning a little within kind of EU political institutions, especially, that there is an opportunity cost. There is kind of, as I say, kind of desire for unanimity is kind of putting a lot of pressure on supportive nations, and kind of the political cost for von der Leyen, for other senior figures within the EU, means that they are really having to put their kind of reputations, political futures on the line in supporting these sanctions, which in the meantime are making a lot of things kind of very painful. And the view that politicians have taken within Central Europe is essentially there is a threshold to people's support. Now, we've seen there's been consistent support, an outpouring of support from Europeans regarding the invasion of Ukraine, but politicians, I think, are underestimating that a little. And it's worth seeing kind of how long kind of that goes on, and also what is Zelensky's response to that. He's obviously kind of endeared himself with millions, if not billions, of people through this stoicism and through this kind of continued campaigning support and kind of continued hounding of nations in a positive way to do the right thing. And many of them have, but I think if there wasn't that pleasure and that more traditional diplomacy may not have occurred. But I think how Ukraine continue to strategize and continue to kind of call out or mention things that will be helpful will be interesting. And I'm sure Dom will kind of have the ability to talk about this in way more detail than me as a kind of man stuck in spreadsheets and kind of business reports.
Well, I mean, we are seeing that play out at the moment. I think there'll be a possibly a slight pause on the pushing for weapons, as in Ukraine have got what they've asked for now. They are very careful about coming across as shrill. So they've now got the biggie, and I think there will now be a pause before they start saying whatever else there is on the list. I think the attention will turn to the political side. It'll be interesting to see. So I'm meeting the Estonian Prime Minister next week. It'll be very interesting to hear from her about this view. As Ben said, those nations closer to Russia and literally bordering Russia, and those that are seeing the threat through a very different lens, really, a much more realist lens in many ways. Although you can't get much more realist than Kissinger, I guess. But you know, they're taking a very different view to a lot of the the rest of Europe, particularly France and Germany. And it's interesting to see this block and see how Ukraine now play the politics. Again, we've talked many times about when do healthy differences of opinion become cracks in the alliance. I don't think we're anywhere near that yet, but the focus on the politics now away from the weapons, I think, will shine a light on some of these issues. And before we speak again, I'll be chatting to the Estonian Prime Minister, and I'll be keen to ask her some of these questions.
Well, thank you, Ben, and thank you, Dom. Can I just ask for your final thoughts then? It might be worth actually me mentioning now to all of our listeners that In the United Kingdom, the Queen's Platinum Jubilee starts tomorrow, so we will not have live shows at 1 p.m. as we usually do. The podcast continues. We've recorded a 100 Days of War for Friday, and we've got a special question and answer podcast based on your questions that you sent in for tomorrow, but we will not be doing a live podcast on the latest updates for the next 2 days. So Ben and Dom, what should we be looking for over Thursday, Friday and the coming weekend?
I think it's kind of worth looking at what is kind of reaction of major politicians, kind of economists, analysts to this latest oil and gas announcement. I think this is in many ways a better deal than a lot of people were expecting, but it still falls short in quite a few ways in terms of sanctions. So something to watch out is what is kind of the analysis of country by country impact. Are we going to begin to see kind of people raising concerns in kind of national economies about the impact of these sanctions? And kind of finally of all, what is the Russian reaction? How are they going to seek to kind of move around these sanctions? Is it kind of possible? Because they are quite widespread. And kind of how does that materialize? Because obviously Russia is going to try and evade sanctions. It doesn't want its economy to become completely kind of fortress as it already was, but it has become even more. So what is the Russian reaction to this going on, and kind of how do smaller states that kind of, as we say, are more financially exposed to sanctions, or more dependent on the Russian economy, how strong is their support? How steadfast is it?
And Dom Nicholls, would you like the final words?
Thank you. Yes, I think the focus from the military side, from the operational side in country, has got to still be on Severodonetsk, on the city. I mean, Russia they've gone all in now. They cannot take a pause. They've got to keep grinding through that city. If they don't take it now, then I don't know if they will. Interesting to look at some of the stats coming out from the battles there. The how few Russian armoured vehicles and personnel are being killed outside of the city, and that suggests that either Ukrainian forces are running out of ammunition, which I don't think is the case, because otherwise we would see this mass breakout to the west. It might be a suggestion that there are no hundreds of Russian armoured vehicles there. We've talked before about how they're having to rely on T-62, and they're taking a huge hit rate on their armoured vehicles. So I think they are close to culminating, which is when you might not be going back, but you can no longer continue offensive action, and they have to take, from their point of view, Severodonetsk city before that happens, because if they culminate, as I said at the start of this pod, about the different forces, the Chechens, the Wagner Group, the airborne forces, not natural bedfellows. So they are pushing people into this fight to take that city, and if they don't come away with a win in the next few days, then I think any reversal there could be very, very serious for Russia indeed.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio, or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Sophie Coe.